the foggy dance on the deck. The ocean Idyll was a floating city, a shining gem set in steel and glass. Thousands of passengers, eager to forget the grayness of everyday life, immersed themselves in its artificial paradise of pools, restaurants, and round-the-clock shows. But even the brightest lights have their shadow. For Lisa, that shadow was called insomnia. As soon as she closed her eyes, the silence of the cabin would fill with an obsessive hum, an echo of the day's laughter, music, and rumbling elevators. Her mind, overloaded with impressions, refused to switch off, turning the night into a long, agonizing vigil. Sleeping pills only left a bitter taste in her mouth and a heaviness in her limbs, without bringing the desired oblivion. On the fourth night of the cruise, when the numbers on the digital clock froze at 3:17, she threw off her blanket. The air in the cabin felt stale, smelling of plastic and melancholy. She needed real air, sea air, salty, cold. She threw a light robe over her pajamas and slipped into the corridor. It was empty and plunged into semi-darkness, only the emergency lights casting ghostly reflections on the glossy walls. Lisa walked to the exit to the lifeboat deck, knowing it should be locked. The captain's announcement had played during the day over the loudspeakers, polite but firm. Due to passage through a region of increased fog, access to open decks from 22 now to 6 hours is strictly prohibited for your safety. However, the heavy glass door, to her surprise, yielded to a light push. The lock clicked with a quiet, almost complicit sound. Someone from the crew forgot to lock it, flashed through her mind. A feeling of lightly breaking the rules, familiar to every child, tingled sweetly in her nerves. And then she was enveloped by silence. Not just an absence of sound, but some kind of physical substance, thick and lifeless. All the ship's hum, the roar of the engines, the buzz of the air conditioners, vanished, absorbed by something else. She stepped over the threshold. The fog didn't just hang in the air. It was the air, impenetrable, milky white, tangible. It enveloped her like a damp shroud, muffling the light and distorting space. She couldn't see her feet, hidden by the whitish haze. A hand stretched out in front of her lost its shape, just a palm's length away. The world had shrunk to a tiny island around her, beyond which there was nothing. No stars, no ship's lights, no black water below, only this blind, all-consuming whiteness. The air was cold and wet, clinging to her skin with tiny, icy needles. She took a few hesitant steps on the slippery decking, feeling for the railing. It was frightening but strangely euphoric. She felt like the last person in the universe, lost in an infinite, sterile void. And then, through the oppressive silence, as if through a thickness of water, a sound reached her. At first, it was a barely perceptible whisper, a vibration in her bones. Then it grew stronger, took shape. It was music, old, mechanical, creaky, a slow, drawn-out waltz that seemed to come not from any specific direction, but from the fog itself, born in its motionless depths. The sound of a gramophone with a loose spring, a needle scratching a cracked record from her great-grandmother's time. This music wasn't just a melody. It was the smell of oblivion, the taste of cold tea in an abandoned ballroom, the touch of faded velvet. And then she saw them. In the very heart of the fog, about 10 meters away, two silhouettes appeared. They were blurred, like an image on an old photograph, but their movements were strikingly clear and graceful. A couple was dancing. The man, tall and stately, was dressed in a worn but proud uniform of some old steamship line. The woman, elegant and fragile, floated in his embrace, clad in a ball gown from the 1920s. The fringe on the hem swayed rhythmically to the waltz, and a string of pearls around her neck glimmered with a dull, phosphorescent light. They rotated in a slow, hypnotic circle, their feet gliding silently over the wet decking, as if they were dancing not on steel, but on the surface of water. The fog swirled around them, obeying the invisible vortex of their movement, becoming part of the dance. Lisa was paralyzed. This didn't look like a joke or a prank. there was a terrifying, otherworldly authenticity to it. Her mind, exhausted by insomnia, feverishly searched for a rational explanation. A film shoot, a role-playing game. But no technology could create such a dense, oppressive aura. No actors could convey this absolute lifeless grace. "Hey!" Lisa tried to shout, but only a hoarse whisper escaped her throat, swallowed by the cotton-wool fog. "Who are you?" She took a step forward, then another, driven by a mixture of fear and irrepressible curiosity. She needed to see their faces to verify they were real. The dance continued, as if the couple noticed nothing around them, locked in their eternal creaking waltz. The distance closed. 5 meters. 3. She could already make out details, the tarnished gold braiding on the man's tunic, the fine pattern on the fringe of the woman's dress. The man looked over his partner's head, his face hidden in the shadow of his cap, but Lisa felt he was looking at nothing, his gaze fixed on some infinite point in the past. And then the woman turned her head, slowly, smoothly, breaking the line of the dance. Her neck curved with an unnatural serpentine grace. Where a face should have been, there was only smooth, wet, colorless skin. No eyes, no nose, no brows. Just a perfect doll-like convexity, as if someone had stretched wet silk over a void. And in the middle of this smoothness, a mouth, wide, stretched into a horrible, unnatural smile. The corners of the lips rose almost to where her temples should have been. This was not a smile of joy or greeting. It was a grimace of eternal, chilling mockery, a mask of absolute emptiness worn over an abyss. Lisa froze, her own face numb with horror. The blood froze in her veins, turning into an icy slurry. She couldn't move, couldn't make a sound. She just stared into that faceless mask, into that curved mouth, which seemed about to make a sound, but remained silent. And then the woman reached out her hand towards Lisa. Her fingers were long, pale, almost transparent, with nails the color of old ivory. The movement was not sharp, but inviting, smooth, a continuation of the dance. There was no threat in this gesture. There was an offer, an invitation. And in that moment, to the accompaniment of the creaking waltz, Lisa understood everything. This wasn't a ghost in the usual sense. This was something else, ancient as the ocean itself. This was the fog itself, having taken on the forms of those who had drowned long ago, its eternal prisoners. This dance was not a memory. It was a ritual, a trap. To accept this hand meant not just to touch a ghost. It meant to enter their circle, to become part of their waltz, to join them in their eternal fall through the cold, airless layers of fog. It was an invitation to an eternal drowning in this white, bottomless void. To drown without being wet, to disappear while continuing to dance. Her instincts, dormant under layers of fatigue and civilization, roared in unison. Run. She lunged backward towards where she hoped the door was. Her legs buckled, her heart pounded, trying to escape her chest. The creaky music intensified, becoming obsessive, unbearable. She ran through the white haze, seeing nothing, bumping into invisible obstacles. She felt their presence, and not just two, but many now. In the fog around her, other silhouettes appeared and melted away, other couples, all in vintage attire, all swirling in the same endless dead waltz. She bumped into something hard. Glass. The door. Lisa fumbled for the handle, pulled it towards herself with all her might. The door yielded with a quiet groan. She tumbled inside, collapsed onto the cold corridor floor, and crawled away from the opening, veiled in whitish haze, convulsively gulping air that still seemed thick and viscous to her. When, a few minutes later, she found the strength to get up and slam the heavy door shut. Turning the lock firmly, she threw a last glance through the round porthole. The fog beyond the glass was as motionless and thick as ever. No music could be heard, but right on the other side of the glass, pressed right up against it, stood that same woman. Her faceless mask and horrible smile were directed straight at Lisa, and her pale hand was pressed palm first against the glass, as if she was still waiting, still inviting her to join the dance that would never end. Lisa crawled away from the door like a wounded animal, her back hitting the cold wall of the opposite corridor with force. She sat, curled into a ball, clutching her knees with trembling hands, and couldn't tear her eyes away from the fogged-up round porthole. There in the milky white gloom, that same pale, blurry silhouette was still visible. The ghostly hand had disappeared, but the sensation of its icy touch, imagined but no less real, burned Lisa's skin like a dry ice burn. She sat like that for perhaps a minute, perhaps an hour. Time had lost all meaning, dissolving into a sticky, viscous horror. Her mind, trying to defend itself, clung to a straw. Hallucination, breakdown, overwork. But it was a lie, and she knew it on an instinctual level, deeper than any thought. That void beyond the glass, that faceless smile, they were real. More real than the floor beneath her, than the beat of her own heart. The grinding of the lock as she turned the key sounded like a gunshot in the tomb-like silence of the corridor. She stood up, her legs like cotton wool, and trudged to her cabin without looking back. Every step echoed in the empty space, and she fancied that behind her, from around every corner, came a quiet, creaky whisper of the waltz. Morning came grey and joyless. The sun couldn't break through the impenetrable white shroud still enveloping the liner. The ocean Idyll sailed, imprisoned in its own shroud. Lisa, who hadn't slept a wink, looked out the cabin porthole. The fog was as dense as at night, motionless. Dead. She tried to act normally, went down to the restaurant, pretended to have breakfast, but her hands trembled as she brought the coffee to her lips. She caught the glances of other passengers. They laughed, chatted, made plans for the day. They didn't see. They didn't know. They were the blind inhabitants of a fortress city, unaware that the enemy was already within the walls. And then she saw him. In the corner of the restaurant by the largest window sat that same tall man. The one from the couple. He was dressed not in his old-fashioned tunic, but in the ordinary suit of one of the ship's officers. He sat with a perfectly straight back and looked out the window into the white wall of fog, and he was completely dry. His hair, his clothes, not a drop of moisture. But when he slowly turned his head and his gaze swept across the room, Lisa saw his eyes. They were the same color as the fog outside, milky white, without pupils, empty. And floating in them was the same nightmare-familiar eternal smile of his partner. He was here, among them. He could look like anyone. Lisa jumped up from the table, nearly knocking over her chair, and ran out of the restaurant. Her panic was now noticeable. A steward approached her, politely asking if everything was all right. She just shook her head, unable to utter a word. She read polite bewilderment on his face. Hysterical passenger, he was thinking. No one would believe her. No one. She tried to find the captain, a security officer. But everywhere she was met with polite but firm refusals. The captain was busy on the bridge, dealing with navigation issues in difficult conditions. She was advised to rest, to take a sedative. All day the ship lived its usual life under the arrest of the fog. Announcements urged passengers to enjoy the internal entertainment. But Lisa saw what others did not. In the crowd by the pool, she glimpsed a woman in a modern dress, but with the same pearl necklace. In the bar, an elderly gentleman sipping whiskey tapped his fingers on the counter to the beat, the very rhythm of the creaky waltz. They were here, dozens, maybe hundreds. They had woven themselves into the fabric of the ship's reality, like parasites, masquerading as passengers and crew. They didn't attack. They did nothing. They just watched and waited for night, waited for her to be alone, waited for her fear to peak. As evening fell, Lisa finally turned into a cornered animal. She couldn't return to her cabin. The thought of the four walls of that door leading to the deck drove her crazy. She wandered through the ship's interior spaces, through endless corridors. the atrium, the game rooms, and everywhere she saw them, out of the corner of her eye. Briefly, a faceless smile in the reflection of a shop window, a tunic in the crowd dissolving around a corner, a whisper of the waltz coming from nowhere as she passed a blank wall. They were playing with her. They were slowly, inexorably winding the spring of her madness. In the end, exhausted, she crawled into the farthest corner of the farthest reading room in the library on one of the lower decks. It was quiet and empty here. She curled up in a deep armchair in the semi-darkness and just stared into space. She had lost. She had no strength left to fight, and then she heard it. At first quietly, barely discernible, then louder, clearer. Creak, creak, ta-ta-tum. The waltz. It wasn't coming from speakers or from behind a wall. It emanated from the very air in the room. It was born in the vibration of the floor, in the trembling of the pages of books on the shelves. Lisa slowly raised her head. She wasn't frightened. Inside her was only an icy, silent void. From the shadows at the far end of the room, the couple floated out. He in his tunic, she in the ball gown with fringe. They were dancing. Their feet glided silently over the carpet, and their silhouettes were slightly transparent, like smoke. Fog, thick and heavy, began to seep up from under the floor, from the ventilation, filling the room, displacing the air. The woman turned her faceless head towards Lisa. Her horrible smile seemed even wider. She stretched out her hand again. This time the invitation was not to the deck. It was here, to this dance, right here and now. Lisa realized there was nowhere to run. The doors she saw led to other corridors, other halls, where she was also expected. The entire ship had become a ballroom for the dead, an eternal cruise in an eternal fog. She slowly, as if in a dream, rose from the armchair. Her body moved against her will, hypnotized by this accursed music. She no longer felt fear, only an infinite, all-consuming weariness. She took a step towards the ghostly couple. The cold fog embraced her like an old acquaintance. Her fingers almost touched the pale, elongated fingers of the woman, and in that moment, somewhere far away, through the growing hum in her ears, she heard the insistent, alarming sound of the ship's horn. It was calling, warning, trying to break through the enchantment. But it was too late. The dance had begun.